That's resonating, isn't it? Welcome, I'm Gary Strong, the University Librarian, and it's a real pleasure to have you here this afternoon. I want to welcome you for a very special occasion. You wouldn't be here if it weren't for Gary Nash, so many of you know him, but I'm going to tell you a little bit more anyway. He is, of course, Professor of History Emeritus, Director of the National Center for History in Schools, and this afternoon he's going to be discussing A Tragic Betrayal of the New Nation, based on his recent book, Friends of Liberty, Thomas Jefferson, Tadeusz Kosciuszko, and Agrippa Hull, the Tale of Three Patriots, Two Revolutions, and A Tragic Betrayal of Freedom in the New Nation. And that's a mouthful. Gary has a varying array of books to his credit, including The Unknown American Revolution, The Unruly Birth of Democracy and Struggle to Create America, The Forgotten Fifth, African Americans in the Age of the Revolution, First City, Philadelphia and the Forging of the Historical Memory, and Forbidden Love, The Secret History of Mixed Race in America. We're honored to have Gary here to be with us this afternoon for our last Library Associates author reading of the academic year. This has become a very fun series for me and for the library to be able to see authors come and be in this space of library to present. Gary received his Bachelor of Arts and Doctor of Philosophy degrees from Princeton University. He's an elected member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the Society of American Historians, and the American Antiquarian Society. He's been professor of UCLA in the Department of History since 1966. In addition to his role as director of the National Center for History in the Schools, he led the design of 1986 California History and Social Science Framework and co-chaired the National History Standards Project from 1992 to 1996. And since I was around in Sacramento, around the Department of Education during those years, I know what it takes to put a curriculum framework together. And it's sort of like climbing with no ladder or mountain climbing with no rope. And hope that you don't get caught in that rope along the way. So those are significant achievements. Gary and his wife Cindy are also endowment donors to the UCLA Library, and I hope that Gary would speak a little bit about the role of the UCLA Library and how it's played in the research of your books while your talk this afternoon. His reading tonight will focus on Thomas Jefferson, as I mentioned, and I'll let Gary tell you much more about that. I hope you will also be willing to answer a question or two, as most teachers do along the way. After he speaks, we invite you to stay and join us for a reception, and we'll have copies of Friends of Liberty for sale, for which Gary, I know, will just love to be able to sign for you. So please join me in welcoming our friend Gary Nash.
Does that work?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks very much, Gary. And I should say just at the outset that this library has been the joy of my life for the last 44 years. And there's just no way that UCLA would be what it is and climb so high without this fabulous library. So I can't count the number of times I've been in this library. It's got to be a significant fraction of my waking moments over what's creeping up on nearly a half century. So this is the odd trifecta that publishers did not take to when I launched this project, because they did not see how you could put between hardback covers three people so dissimilar as Thomas Jefferson, the very symbol of international freedom, Tadeusz Kosciuszko, lesser known, but a member of the Polish minor nobility, born on the Lithuanian-Polish border, known mostly for his military exploits, in the American Revolution, where he served as a military engineer, and in Poland, where he did his best and almost sacrificed his life to drive the Russians out of his beloved Poland that they had occupied and partitioned 3 times to the point where it no longer existed by 1800. And then the most unlikely figure of all, a young black man born free from western Massachusetts in Stockbridge. But through the efforts of my co-author, Graham Hodges, who teaches at Colgate, we forged ahead on this book. I'm going to do the book in reverse, just give you a few slices of it, but I'm going to start at the end instead of the beginning. So I want to take you back 182 years and to the other side of the country. Probably some of you recognize this building. Monticello. And on a bitterly cold morning on January 5th, 1827, here on the lawn at Monticello, with snow in the air, I'm reading just a paragraph or two, planters streamed up the narrow road for the beginning of the 5-day auction. With the date announced 2 months before, the crowd was thick. Appetites were whetted by the notice that the hammer would come down on horses and cattle, along with household furniture, many valuable historical and portrait paintings, busts of marble and plaster of distinguished individuals, one marble of Thomas Jefferson by Carracci, Jefferson's polygraph, which for 20 years he used to copy thousands of letters he wrote, and heightening the tension was the widely circulated announcement that the unfortunate slaves scheduled for the auction block, quote, are believed to be the most valuable for their number ever offered at one time in the state of Virginia, unquote. I think perhaps 130 valuable Negroes, stock, probably, household and kitchen foot. Thomas Jefferson Randolph, Jefferson's grandson and manager of his grandfather's estate, Jeffy, Thomas called him, solemnly witnessed the affair as the brisk bidding began. Jeffy, the grandson, said it was like a captured village in ancient time when all were sold as slaves. Standing on the auction block were 130 valuable slaves, the living residue of the total of 606 slaves who had toiled during Jefferson's lifetime in 5 counties where Jefferson had owned land. The hammer came down on the lots one by one to the highest bidders. Some slaves were sold singly, others as man and wife, none as complete families, so far as the auction receipts indicate. Around the nation, newspapers decried the tear-drenched auction. Baltimore's Niles Register wished, quote, that Jefferson's slaves had been liberated and removed to the African colony. That would be the new colony about to be formed of Liberia. In the Susquehanna River town of Milton, Pennsylvania, the newspaper asked how Jefferson, quote, surely the champion of civil liberty to the American people, left so many human beings in fetters to be indiscriminately sold to the highest bidder. In biting words, the newspaper wrote, heaven inspired Jefferson with the knowledge that all men are created equal. He was not. In his last moments, he commended his soul to God and his daughter to his country. But to whom did he commend his wretched slaves? Could it have been different? How might it have been different? Well, it could have, because of the remarkable friendship that Jefferson had developed with Tadeusz Kosciuszko. If you go upstairs to the 3rd floor and paw through well over 100 biographies of Thomas Jefferson, check the index under Kosciusko, and you will see that he is not mentioned in all but a very few. He has disappeared from the Jefferson story. But he was a close friend of Jefferson. Indeed, Jefferson called him the truest son of liberty I have ever met. But now let me tell you a little bit about the ardent friendship that they forged. Kosciusko had come to this country as the revolution broke out and became one of Washington's most important military engineers. He was at Saratoga, and much of the American victory there that brought the French into the war with the Americans was Kosciusko's doing, for his understanding of the terrain and his ability to slow the British marching army down as it approached Saratoga. He was then at West Point. Before it was a military academy, it was a fortification guarding the Hudson River. And there he built the fortifications that blocked the British Navy from coming up the Hudson. And then he was at a great many of the southern battles through the South, where he was Washington's chief military engineer. He went back to Poland after the war, and here's where he gained international fame on the battlefields outside Krakow, outside Warsaw. He was the fearless leader, the person who tried to, here he is on horseback, led peasants with pikes only against British artillery. It was a mismatch. The odds were terribly uneven. And apart from losing most of the battles, he almost lost his life. This was in 1792 to 94. And on the battlefield, here at Brocklowicz, outside Krakow, he was taken all off the field, all but dead, carried by the Russian army back to Russia and thrown into the prison at St. Petersburg, the fortress prison. And there he was for 3 years. Then in 1797, after the Empress Catherine died, the Tsar Paul took the throne and took pity on Kosciusko. Kosciusko was released from prison, and that's when he came back to the United States for his second sojourn. He was lame, he could not walk. This is a lithograph of a painting done by Benjamin West when Kosciusko passed through London on the way to Philadelphia in the summer of 1797. And he took up modest rooms at 3rd and Pine Street in Philadelphia today. They have been restored in this very small bedchamber on the 2nd floor where he rented these chambers. And it was here in 1797 that he and Jefferson became close friends. Jefferson was the vice president under Adams, but it was not an easy relationship. The vice president didn't really count. They weren't elected in the same way they are today. Jefferson was the president of the American Philosophical Society. Kosciusko was elected to it, and they spent many evenings together in this tiny bedchamber, talking. And it was here in May of 1798 when Kosciusko had to leave the country because he was under suspicion of being an agent of the French Revolution, that Jefferson hustled him out under a false passport. And then, before it was time to go, Kosciusko knew he had to write a will. Now, the will involved all of his military pay for 7 years in the Continental Army. It amounted to about $14,000, which is a very large number in the 1790s. With Jefferson at his elbow, this is the will that Kosciusko wrote. The writing is very difficult to see here, so I'll read a piece of it for you. This document is hidden in plain sight. You will find it in no Jefferson biography that I know of. But it was in this will that Kosciusko left his entire American state to Jefferson. I beg Mr. Jefferson that in the case I should die, without testament. He should buy out of my monies. This is rather fractured English. He was very fluent in Russian and Polish and French. His English was so-so. He should buy, Mr. Jefferson, should buy out of my money so many Negroes and free them, that the remaining sum should be sufficient to give them education and provide for their maintenance. That is to say, each should know before the duty of a citizen in a free government, and that he must defend his country against foreign as well as internal enemies who would wish to change the Constitution, and to have a good and human heart. And each should have 100 acres of land with instruments and cattle for tillage, and know how to manage and govern it well as to know how to behave to neighbors, always with kindness and ready to help themselves, frugal to their children, to give a good education. I mean as to the heart and the duty to their country, in gratitude to me, to make themselves happy as possible. T. Kosciusko. Then the next day, Jefferson came back to help him rewrite the will, dress up the English language, then change the wording in a most extraordinary way. Rather than the vague reference in the original version, to use his American money. To free, quote, so many Negroes, that's the wording of the first will. It was now changed to say, I do hereby declare direct that should I make no other testamentary disposition of my property in the United States, I hereby authorize my friend Thomas Jefferson to employ the whole thereof in purchasing Negroes from among his own or any others. In a stroke, Jefferson's slaves have become the favored beneficiary of Kosciusko's benevolence. They sealed the pact. This is how the will was written into the Albemarle County Courthouse book some years later, and we'll get to that in a moment. But as they parted, Kosciusko made gifts to Jefferson. This rather charming watercolor that Kosciusko did of Jefferson while they were sitting in that third and pine second-story bedchamber. And here, many of you will recognize this. This is Rembrandt Peale's portrait of Jefferson. But the fur collar, all the Americans who've looked at that know little that was bestowed by Kosciusko to Jefferson. And then this painting by Benjamin West, given to Kosciusko when he was coming through London on the way to America. And that's called The Fright of Astyanax, and you will find it in the Getty Museum today, passed down through various owners. So the truest son of liberty I have ever met slipped out of Philadelphia on a dark night in the middle of May in 1798, boarded a ship down the Delaware River, made his way back to Europe, again to try to salvage Poland from the grasp of the Russian bear. Over the next 19 years, until Kosciusko died in 1817, they kept up a lively correspondence. They were truly men of liberty and very fond of each other. Here's Kosciusko just before his death. He died in a village at the foot of the Alps in Solure, Switzerland. But till the very end, he and Jefferson maintained this friendship. Let me quote from the last letters they wrote to each other. Jefferson could follow Kosciusko's whereabouts in the newspapers because Kosciusko was famous by this time, and every time he appeared in public, it was noted in the newspapers, the scent of this country. Jefferson knew in 1817, Jefferson himself was growing old, that Kosciusko was near death. And so he wrote in the last letter, "Come to Monticello, my dear friend, and be one of our family." Kosciusko declined, said he did not want to encroach on Jefferson's hospitality. Jefferson replied, and this is the last letter, that the Pole could build a house or rent one near to Monticello, and there he could dine with Jefferson every day, and, these are Jefferson's words, to close the life of liberty in the land of liberty. And come lay your bones with mine in the cemetery at Monticello. Unquote. This would be a perfect way for Kosciusko to manage his American assets while allowing Jefferson, quote, to give you in person assurances of affectionate friendship and support. In a final letter to Jefferson, penned on September 15, 1817, a few weeks before Kosciusko died, he reminded Jefferson of the will and the solemn oath that they had made in Philadelphia in May of 1798. Of his American assets, he wrote to Jefferson, quote, "After my death, you know the fixed destination," unquote. Now we have to fast forward, not very long, but just 2 years. I'm going to have to find that. I forgot to mark it here. Jefferson had to think about this. He learned of Kosciusko's death, and now the decision had to be made. He was both the executor and the beneficiary of the Kosciusko American will. And that after conferring with friends and pondering this, Jefferson decided to mount his horse and ride down the hill to the Albemarle County courthouse. Here are the words of the court's deputy clerk, whom Jefferson would soon appoint as librarian of the University of Virginia. This was William Werdenbaker, the grandfather of Thomas Jefferson Werdenbaker, who was the early American historian at Princeton when I first enrolled there in 1951. And here is what William Werdenbaker wrote in the court record. "An illustrious man then and at all times, the observed of all observers, walked into the courtroom. The judge, perceiving that Thomas Jefferson, stately and erect, was standing before him, bowed and invited him to take a seat upon the bench. To this Mr. Jefferson replied, quote, 'As soon as your honor shall have leisure to attend to me, I have a matter of business to present to the court.' Immediately, by consent of all parties concerned," well, who wouldn't consent to the former President of the United States and the author of the Declaration of Independence come forward, "by consent of all parties concerned, the matter then before the court was suspended until Mr. Jefferson could be heard." He pulled out of his pocket a paper, which he said was the will of his friend, General Tadeusz Kosciuszko. That the will was written in the handwriting of the testator, with which he was well acquainted, and to which fact he was ready to testify on oath. He, Mr. Jefferson, was made executor of the will, but at his time of life, he said it was not in his power to undertake the duties of the office, and that necessity compelled him to decline qualifying. The usual oath was administered to Mr. Jefferson by the clerk, and the will was ordered by the court to be admitted to record. Well, I dare say that such a momentous moment had rarely transpired in the Albemarle County Courthouse. Here was the author of the Declaration of Independence, a revered Enlightenment figure on both sides of the Atlantic, the former Secretary of State under the nation's first president and third president of the United States himself, had dismounted from his horse and unceremoniously walked into the county courthouse to relinquish the executorship of a will drafted by one of the most famous warriors for freedom in the Western world, and to renege on the pledge he made in Philadelphia 21 years before. In stepping down from administering the will of his treasured friend, Jefferson also surrendered the opportunity to free his own children and his mistress, that is, the children that Sally Hemings bore, along with dozens of other slaves who toiled alongside her. All could have gone free at no expense to Jefferson. He would have had the money. By this time it had amounted to about $18,000. He would have had the money and the slaves would be free. He was very deeply in debt by this time. So he could have had this both ways in a sense. Well, that's the tragic betrayal and the breach of honor. But I want to end on a higher note, and that's where Agrippa Hull comes in. We have to ask the question, why did Kosciusko will this sum of money to Jefferson? He could have taken his American military pay from the Revolutionary years back to Europe and put it to the cause of creating a free Poland again. He had estates in Poland, and he had French assets too. But as for his American estate, he decided to leave it for this purpose. In all of the biographies of Kosciusko, most in Polish, but many in English, you will never find a mention of this man, who I think is the key to why Kosciusko made that decision. He now, as an old man in his 80s, living out his life just before, this is on the eve of the Mexican-American War of 1848, this was the man who had been assigned to Kosciusko as an orderly. By Kosciusko's side for 50 consecutive months, day in, day out, in an era of no furloughs or Christmas leaves or home leaves, for 50 months, they fought side by side in the American Revolution. Now Hull, to be sure, was an orderly. He was a mere enlisted man. But there is a bond that does develop between an orderly and an officer. And this is an officer of rank. Kosciusko asked Hull to return at the end of the war to Poland with him. Hull said no, he had to return to the Berkshire Hills in western Massachusetts. His mother was dying there. He wanted to go home. At that point, Kosciusko gave him a beautiful pistol manufactured in Warsaw with inlay of silver and the gunmaker's name inscribed on it. He took buttons off his jacket and gave them to Hull and wished him well. When he came back in 1797, he made it his business to see Agrippa Hull again. And Agrippa Hull by this time was making his way in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. They had seen so much in the war. They had seen the Virginia and North Carolina and South Carolina slaves fleeing to the British Army when the British offered freedom to slaves who escaped to their ranks. And Kosciusko had seen the free black community developing in Philadelphia and New York City after the war. He saw it even more so when he came back in 1797. It has to be there has to be a degree of inference in this, but I feel strongly that Agrippa Hull had made his mark on Kosciusko. We speak of historical agency, someone who, through the power of his rhetoric, makes a difference. That could not have been the case with Agrippa Hull. He was a mere 18-year-old when he was assigned to be Kosciusko's orderly. Some make a difference through the power of what they write and publish. That could not be so, because Agrippa Hull never wrote a letter in his life or published a pamphlet of any kind. His historical agency was simply a matter of force of character, or so I believe. And the bond grew between them. Now let's go back to this one other picture I showed you previously, when Tsar Paul is releasing Kosciusko from the Petersburg fortress prison. And who is that? This is a lithograph done from a painting, which has disappeared, but the lithograph was published in London, just a year after Kosciusko was released and headed for America. We know from the record, some of them recently came to notice in the Moscow archives, that this is a man known in the records there as Jean-Pierre. And this is a painting recently found in the basement of a Krakow museum. This is Jean-Pierre. When Kosciusko headed for America, the Warsaw newspaper said that he was attended through those years in prison, indeed from the time he came back from America to Poland, by what they called in the Polish newspaper his inseparable companion. Now he was something of a servant too, I believe. In the prison he served as a kind of orderly, or perhaps even as a chef, but he was free, he was paid, but he was with Kosciusko for all of those years from 1784 to 1797, which is to say that for 16 years of his life, from the time the American Revolution began until 1797, he had an African American at his side. Of this you will find no notice of in the Polish biographies of Kosciusko. But it has a lot to do with that will that Jefferson wrote. It has a lot to do with the fact that Kosciusko freed his own serfs and tried to lead the move to abolish serfdom in Poland. Well, Agrippa Hull, as it turned out, perhaps you'll forgive me if I say more a man of his word and a man of honor than even Jefferson. He went to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and he became the black equivalent of Jefferson's white yeoman farmer. Industrious, abstemious, moral, devoted to family, and devoted to community. He became, in fact, a kind of hero in western Massachusetts. He had married, he had children, he sheltered runaway slaves, he and his wife, and he grew up there as a kind of model citizen. Catherine Sedgwick, the novelist of the 1830s and 40s and 50s, knew Agrippa Hull very well, because when Agrippa Hull came back from the American War, he served in the household of the Sedgwick family. And Sedgwick made a trip to West Point on a final pilgrimage with Agrippa Hull in 1834, and she recorded her impressions of him in a magazine for young people. Hull, she said, was slightly bent by the rheumatism and his locks somewhat grizzled, but beneath his fleecy locks and black complexion was a mind as sagacious as Sancho's, Cervantes' Sancho Panza, and a gift of expression resembling in its point and quaintness that droll sage. He is, however, far superior to Sancho. For with his humor, he blends no small portion of the sentiment and delicacy of Sancho's master. He was one of a large party that included the young, the gay, and the beautiful. But he was, as most fitting, the most noticed and honored of them all. He was the only black man in his entourage of Stockbridge people to West Point in 1834. And later that, just before, several years before Hull died, we have another vivid account of him by Francis Parkman, who was to become the mid-19th century's most famous American historian. Francis Parkman was only 21 years old, a year from graduating from Harvard, when he came through Stockbridge in the summer of 1844. And there he found Agrippa Hull in the yard of the Congregational Church. I found the old Negro who had been a soldier in Washington's army, hale and buoyant in his 85th year. Parkman then got into a conversation with Grippy, as he was known in Stockbridge, Grippy for Agrippa. Grippy remembered all about the Indians. Stockbridge had been an Indian mission town when Agrippa Hull grew up there in the 1750s and 60s. And there he was, trading recollections of the Indians with Oliver Partridge, the octogenarian village doctor and Hull's friend. Parkman noted this in his journal. Hull was known as the African prince, and indeed Hull did claim he was descended from an African prince who had been brought in chains to America. And then Parkman described the solemn countenance on Grippy's face as he talked about his 4 children in the churchyard. His sons and daughters had died earlier. And then Parkman went on to recount that Grippy had adopted all of the youth of Stockbridge. Parkman scribbled this in the journal. Grippy said, "But these are my children," stretching his cane over a host of little boys. They were accustomed to clambering up on his knee. They wanted to hear all the stories of the Revolution, all the battles where Agrippa Hull had been, with Tadeusz Kosciuszko. Ah, said Grippy, how much we are concerned to fetch them up well and virtuous. And described how Grippy was, quote, very philosophical, and every remark carried the old patriarch into lengthy orations on virtue and temperance. He looked on himself as father to all Stockbridge. End quote. Electa Jones, the village historian, dwelt on the same point. Quote, never until the secrets of all hearts are revealed can the schoolboy know how much of his fairness in games or his safety from the wiles of those older than himself was in answer to the fervent prayer of this humble servant of God, Agrippa Hull. So this, I think, is how we try to bring this story together of these 3 people who were so dissimilar in their backgrounds and yet so much the same in what they hoped for as a free world of universal freedom, of universal equality. But in the end, it was really Kosciusko Hull who did his part and Agrippa Hull who tried to live out the dream of the revolutionary generation. And as for Jefferson, it is one of those tragic moments. He said to his friends that he was too old and too frail to carry out the duties as executor of the estate. This was in 1817. In fact, though he was old, in his upper 70s, he was in full flood of building the University of Virginia. That's precisely when it was being brought together. He was hale enough to ride his horse 30 miles a day for meetings of those in the legislature who needed to fund the University of Virginia. The problem was different. It really was a difficulty that I believe he could never solve. The wretched trap that he was a part of. He could not, in the end, betray his class, his planter friends, the Virginia aristocracy, the slave-owning Virginians. And when Kosciusko died, and he thought this over, in the end, he held with the Virginia aristocracy. Poles, some of them well into the mid-20th century, believed that Kosciusko's money had gone to free many of Jefferson's slaves. But this was not the case. It was not to be. So I will leave it at that, and be very glad to answer your questions or receive your criticisms.
Gary, if the terms of the will were written down and entered into the court, why weren't they pursued by the court itself? And the other part of that was he had, part of his pay was 500 acres someplace, and what happened with that?
Yes, part of his military pension was 500 acres in the Western Reserve, which is Ohio, Western Reserve University, Cleveland. It's called the Western Reserve. That was the land on the other side of the Appalachians reserved for the officers and other soldiers of the American Revolution. He got 500 acres. He had it sold, surveyed and sold, with the money to go to establish a school for free young blacks in Newark, New Jersey, where he had friends and old Revolutionary officer compatriots. The land was sold, the money was delivered, and the school was never built. It was going to be called the Kosciusko School. That land is part of the Ohio State University campus today. And old-timers around Columbus, Ohio still speak of it. The old maps still speak of it as the Kosciusko lands. But the court, once he stepped down as executor and said he would not be the beneficiary of the money, he tried to find a substitute executor. And he hoped, the months were rolling along into 1819, into 1820, and so on, he hoped that perhaps the money would go to support sending free black Americans back to Africa. But that never happened either. There were attempts to use the money to build a school in Maryland, what would be suburban Washington today. That didn't work. There were many attempts. Will was caught up in the courts until 1852. It finally reached the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court Justice was Roger Taney, a Southern pro-slavery judge. And Taney ruled that the money should not be used for any purpose benefiting black Americans. It should be sent back to Poland and distributed among the grandnieces of Kosciusko, who never married, never had children of his own. These were his sister's granddaughters by 1852. And that's what happened to the Kosciusko American estate.
I'm wondering, is there any line of continuity between this African American community in Stockbridge and W.E.B. Du Bois?
Yes, there is. W.B. Du Bois grew up in Great Barrington in the Berkshires, which is just a little farther down the Housatonic River. Stockbridge is on the Housatonic, Great Barrington a little farther down. And there were free black communities, very small free black communities all along those river towns. And there is even in one of the biographies of Du Bois a suggestion that they were related, but I think that's not the case. Andy?
Gary, I think that I'm right in saying that the highest mountain peak in Australia is named Mount Kosciusko. Did he go down there, or what's the story there?
Oh, that's right. Though there's a movement to rename it today, but as was the case in Indiana, Texas, and Mississippi, all of which have towns and counties named for Kosciusko, it was the sons of Revolutionary War officers who revered Kosciusko and moved out on the frontiers in different parts of the world and wanted to remember Kosciusko and honor him. And that's how Mount Kosciusko was named in New South Wales. Yes, it's the highest peak. And where was Oprah Winfrey born? Kosciusko, Mississippi. Trying to get her to, take notice of this book, but so far, no luck.
I tried that too.
Yes, please.
Did you know there's a street called Kosciusko in Los Angeles?
I do know. It's down by Disney Hall.
Okay.
It's probably the shortest street in downtown LA. And it was named, it was a little hard to trace how it came to be honored in Los Angeles, but it was Polish Americans here in the 1930s who wanted to have his name inscribed on, even if it was a very short street. You'll find bridges, monuments right across from the White House in Lafayette Park. There's a wonderful equestrian statue, Kosciusko, in different parts of the country. And there are about 10 million Polish Americans, and for them, Kosciusko is a great hero. Pulaski is the number 2 hero, but he died during the revolution and didn't get a chance to go back to fight against the Russians. Well, thank you very much for coming.